Okay, hopefully that was ample time to complete the warm-up for the day. Let's go ahead and get ready to take some good, thorough, comprehensive, efficient, and effective notes so that we can return to these notes as we begin our preparations for the EOC, which is going to take place about 4 weeks from now. The lesson that we are going over today is called Evidence of Evolution. Today's date is November 13th, 2020, and it is the 4th day of our 8th unit. So as you all get your notebooks out and you're ready to write down these notes, write down the title, the date, and the day of the unit, I will introduce the objective of the lesson to you. So by the end of today, biologists will be able to explain how fossil, biochemical, and anatomical evidence support the theory of evolution. And our essential question for the day is, which evidence of evolution is the most compelling? That means we're trying to figure out which of these 4 evidences of evolution that we'll introduce today provides the strongest case that the theory of evolution is correct. Now, I want to be very careful with my language here because this theory of evolution is just that. It is a theory. We have a lot of evidence that supports that theory, a lot of evidence that would lead a reasonable person to conclude that evolution has taken place over the course of the lifespan of Earth. But other people have different sources of belief. Other people have different belief systems, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. What we're discussing today is simply the evidence that allows a reasonable person to arrive at the conclusion that the theory of evolution is correct, that there is enough reason to believe that life began in simple forms and eventually over time became more complex and became much more diverse. So we're going to talk about the evidence that exists today, and hopefully you all have now readied your notebooks and you are ready to start the lesson. Before we actually get into the notes, I need to have your attention, please, because far too many of you have not taken the Unit 7 test. I have a list of all of the names of the people who have not taken the Unit 7 test. And not only is this potentially going to hurt your grade, but it's also causing some of your classmates some issues as well. The reason for this is that all of the tests are curved. They are curved so that the average score will end up receiving a 70%, which typically means that there's a boost of at least 15 points, sometimes 10 points. But because so few people have taken the test, I do not have enough data to curve the test properly. So if your name is Alejandro, if your name is Nicole, if your name is Brian Castellan Avalos, if your name is DJ, if your name is Brian Galvin Saldana, if your name is Yanid, if your name is Michelle, Brandon, Brian Shipes, Joseph Smith, Merle, Ashley, Ayana, Faith, and David, you all have a Unit 7 test that you need to take. You need to contact me so we can find a time to take this test. It cannot happen during the class period, which is unfortunate because we dedicate a class period to taking the test, and many of you were here on that day, which was a week ago today. But we can't look back. We just need you to get this test done, and it can take place. We can do it during an advisory session. We can do it after school. We can do it before school, but it needs to be done. Okay, so contact me as soon as possible. You can text me, you can email me, you can send me a message on Canvas, you can send me a message on Remind, but whatever it takes, we need to have a plan to get these tests taken. Otherwise, it's going to severely hurt your grade because the tests are formal. So having a 0 in the grade book for a formal grade is going to be very difficult to bounce back from. All right, so let's make sure we get that taken care of ASAP. All right, so for those of you who did knock out the warm-up, I appreciate you. And you have also seen this question already. For everybody else, once we go over this question, that means that you have at least one review question complete, one question from the warm-up already completed. So let's go through this. Question is, eukaryotic autotrophs contain both chloroplasts and mitochondria within their cells. which best describes how these two organelles are dependent on one another in these specific organisms? All right, so there's a lot of information presented there. It's only a 2-sentence question, but it packs a lot. We've got some phrases that hopefully we know, but they are somewhat confusing phrases. They can be because they're big words and they are unfamiliar words. The first one that I see is a 2-word phrase, and it is eukaryotic autotroph. What does a eukaryotic autotroph mean? What is that? Someone help me out. What is a eukaryotic autotroph? Even if you just have an idea, let's just go ahead and unmute ourselves and just give me that idea so we can move on. Okay, let's break it down. What is a eukaryote? What makes a eukaryote special? Because it's different than a prokaryote. Okay, thank you, Jessica. Eukaryotic autotrophs are primarily plants for the purposes of this class. But I do want to break this down so that you all fully understand this phrase. Now, you should be taking notes, even if these are things that, maybe you have already taken notes on. If you didn't already know this answer, that means you need to be writing this down. Excuse me. A eukaryotic autotroph is an organism that is eukaryotic, meaning that it has complicated cells. These cells have nuclei, they have chloroplasts, they have mitochondria, they have vacuoles, they have all these different organelles inside of them that a simpler type of life, like a prokaryote, wouldn't have. So a eukaryotic cell or a eukaryotic organism is one that has nuclei. An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food. So this typically means that this is an organism that does photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process that uses light to make glucose. So there was a lot of information packed in those 2 words. And if you don't know what those 2 words are, then it obviously makes the rest of the question a little bit harder to answer. But if you do know what those two words mean, and you can pull out a lot of information from them, then it makes answering the question a lot easier. Okay, so you've got to be able to be strategic. You've got to be surgical with these questions. You've got to slice them up. You've got to pull out information from them. Let's move on. So we've also got 2 other words here that I think are important: chloroplast and mitochondria. What is a chloroplast and what is a mitochondrion? What do they do for the cell? Come on, folks. This is information from Unit 2. This should be rapid fire. What is a chloroplast? What is a mitochondrion? What do they do? Yes, thank you, Jessica. Mitochondria are the power plants or the powerhouses of the cell. Excuse me, they produce energy for the cell. What about a chloroplast? This is why we take notes, because you all should definitely be able to flip back and find this information somewhere in your notebook. What is a chloroplast? And another answer from Jessica. Thank you. Chloroplasts are responsible for capturing light energy. Really, what this means is that chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. Chloroplasts do photosynthesis. They are what makes the glucose for plants. They make food for plants. I need everybody who did not answer, which is all but one person, to pause right now and ask yourself, am I doing all that I can to succeed in this class? Have I written down enough notes? Do I have the ability to refer back to my notes? Am I pushing myself to answer questions as Mr. Rudd asks them? Because this is information that should be rapid fire when we are 8 units into the class. We should know what a chloroplast is because it's come up not only in 2, but in several other units since then. So we need to do some self-reflecting here. Some of you all need to step it up so we are in a good place to perform well on the EOC. I'm working hard. I'm stepping my game up too to assist you all. And some of you are working well with me. Some of you are working hard as well. But others need to step it up. We are running out of time here. We're not out of time yet, but we are getting to that point. All right, so these warm-up questions, these should be, you should be knocking these out easily in the 6 minutes that you're given. And then the question asks us, we need to find some type of dependency between the chloroplast and the mitochondria. How do they depend on one another, specifically in plants? That's what that part is saying. So in a plant cell, how do chloroplast and mitochondria depend on one another? So at this point, if you were able to pull out good information from those words, you probably can make a prediction about what the answer will be without even looking at the answer choices. But let's take a look at the answer choices just in case. The chloroplast uses carbon dioxide to produce oxygen, which is then used by the mitochondria for anaerobic respiration. Now, that is actually a pretty good answer choice. The problem is that this word is anaerobic. The word anaerobic means without oxygen. So it doesn't make sense that the oxygen that is produced by the chloroplast is then going to be used for anaerobic respiration. That's just backwards. Anaerobic respiration, by definition, means without oxygen. So that one is incorrect. B, the mitochondria are responsible for providing the genetic instructions, and the chloroplasts are the organelles responsible for making the proteins coded by the genetic instructions. Hopefully you all have some thoughts about this, but when we see genes, we should be thinking about a very specific organelle, and that organelle is not the mitochondrion. That organelle is the nucleus. Whenever we're thinking about genes or DNA, we should be thinking about the nucleus. And whenever we're thinking about proteins, we should be thinking about ribosomes. Ribosomes are responsible for making proteins. So this one, it has some good information, but it's missing, or it has substituted the mitochondria and the chloroplast where it should have the nucleus and the ribosomes. C, the chloroplast is responsible for creating glucose through photosynthesis. Then the mitochondria use that glucose to produce ATP through respiration. That's a good answer. That answer is good because it defines what both of those organelles do. It says the chloroplast does photosynthesis to create glucose. And it says that the mitochondria does respiration to create ATP using glucose. So we have all good information there, and we also have a link between them. It says that the chloroplasts make the glucose, and then the mitochondria use that glucose. So that's going to be a good answer, but let's check D just to make sure. D says the mitochondria use the process photosynthesis to create glucose, and then the chloroplasts use the glucose to create ATP. That's backwards. So C and D are the same information, but they are inverses of one another. They switch around the words chloroplast and mitochondria. So C is your answer in this case. Now, the takeaway here is that if I can pull out information from the question, then before I even look at my answer choices, I should have a pretty good idea of what the correct answer will be without even looking. That sets you up in a great place to succeed and do well on the answer, on the question. So if you all can figure out a way to do that, pull out the information from the question, I guarantee you your success on these tests will become much more likely. So no notes to take on this slide. This is just a quick review of what we talked about yesterday. We introduced the concept of natural selection, which is the idea that individuals with the most suitable adaptations survive and can then reproduce. So individuals who have specific traits that give them an advantage in their environment, in their ecosystem, in their habitat, those are the same individuals who will go on to survive. They might have greater access to food. They might have greater access to safety. So they survive. And because they survive, they reproduce. And by reproducing, they pass on their genes. Now, in order for natural selection to occur, a population needs to have genetic variation. The good thing is that all sexually reproducing organisms are guaranteed to have genetic variation. The reason for this is because genetic variation is a result of meiosis, and all sexual reproducing organisms undergo meiosis. This means that even if we think about two roaches, and well, not two roaches, let's think about two ants, and those two ants mate, and they have 500 offspring. Every single sperm from the male ant and every single egg from the female ant is totally different from another. They're all totally unique. This means that all 500 of their offspring, although they will be very genetically similar to one another, they will not be exactly the same. So some of those 500 offspring might have a specific advantage over others in that population. So genetic variation is going to result in natural selection, as some organisms have specific traits that give them their advantage. We also talked about geographic isolation, which causes speciation. So geographic isolation occurs when a population gets split apart. A population of organisms is split apart. Maybe it's because a new river forms after some severe flooding. And so now the organisms can no longer reach each other. Maybe it's because a forest fire burns down some of the habitat. And so now the population has been split. They've been fragmented into two. Whatever the cause of the geographic isolation, the result is that a population gets split apart. And over time, it's possible that those two populations, which started off as one, will now end up as two different species. It's possible that that could happen. And that's what we refer to as speciation, when two new species arrives out of one. Now, today, as I mentioned, we are talking about the evidence that exists for the theory of evolution. The first type of the four that we will discuss is fossil evidence. So please do write down everything that you see that is highlighted. Fossil evidence. Fossil evidence are preserved remains, impressions, or traces of dead organisms from a past geological age. So these are organisms that have left maybe tracks in the ground, or maybe some of their skeleton is preserved, or in some cases, even different biological matter might be preserved depending on what it's preserved in. And then over time, those fossils are incorporated into the ground, and they get sunk further and further into the ground as new layers of rock form on top. And because they are preserved, they give us a great insight into what the Earth may have been like many millions of years ago, or yeah, and even more recently than that in some cases. And so one of the examples of the information that fossils can provide to us is Pangea. So we can look at the fossil record, and for example, we've got this organism here called Synignathus. We found fossils from Synignathus, which is a reptile, in South America, in what is today Brazil and Paraguay and Chile. We found fossils of that reptile in South America, but we also found fossils from that reptile in Africa, in what's today the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Angola.
Is it still alive, like an animal like that?
No, this would be an extinct organism. But that organism does have some ancestors that would be, that do exist today. It has ancestors of different species that do exist today. But because we have found fossils from this organism in both South America and Africa, which obviously today are separated by the Atlantic Ocean by hundreds, thousands of miles of water, we know that it's impossible that these land-dwelling organisms could have made it from Africa to South America, unless at one point Africa and South America were much closer to one another and maybe even connected. And we can do the same thing with other fossils as well. We see fossils from another type of reptile, Lystrosaurus. We see fossils from that reptile in what is today Ethiopia and Namibia, as well as Madagascar and India, and even Antarctica. So of course, it's impossible that this reptile could have crossed the Indian Ocean and crossed the Arctic Ocean to end up in all these different continents, unless at one point those continents were much closer and potentially even connected to one another. So these fossil records provide us evidence that at one point, the 7 continents were connected as a singular supercontinent that we call Pangea. And then over the course of millions of years, with the movement of the tectonic plates that exist just below the surface of the Earth, as those tectonic plates shift because they lay on top of a layer of molten lava, essentially, so they move around. As that happens, the continents drifted apart from one another, and now they are separated by vast oceans. So these fossils provide evidence that life evolved from simple to more complex forms. Life evolved to move from water to land, and life existed over 4 billion years ago. So again, please do write down the highlighted information on this slide. So we can see that in that fossil on the left, that is a fossilized plant that was one of the earliest land-dwelling photosynthetic plants. So in the beginning, life existed solely in the oceans. It existed solely in water. The reason for this is there was no ozone layer. So the sun's rays were extremely harsh. The UV radiation killed anything that could have existed on land or even near the surface of the water. So all life existed, underwater at some point to shield itself from that radiation. But eventually, as oxygen began to be produced via photosynthesis, the ozone layer formed, and it formed a protective layer that shielded life from the harshness of the sun's UV radiation. And this allowed life to begin to move onto land. This fossil is a fossil of a plant that was one of the earliest species to do that. And in fact, for about 40 million years, this specific plant species was one of the only plant species that existed on land. It dominated the landscape. And so because of that, it is one of the oldest ancestors of all of the plants and trees that we know to exist on Earth today. In the middle, we can see a fossil of a fish that had fins that were joined to its body by only a single bone. And so this is evidence of this fish being an ancestor of tetrapods. Tetrapods are every organism that has 4 limbs, which is most of the organisms that we know exist on land today. So this plant there's not really much evidence that shows that we are a direct descendant of this fish, but it is representative of one of the ancestors that we might have. I'll talk more about that in a few slides. And then on the far right, we can see footprints that are about 3.7 million years old, which were left by ancient ancestors of humans. So these people or these organisms were not actually human beings, but they were not Homo sapiens like we are, but they were an ancient ancestor of Homo sapiens. The footprints themselves, we can see that the big toe is not opposable. So if we think about our ape friends, gorillas and chimpanzees, they have big toes that are opposable, which means that they have the ability to swing from their feet in trees. Of course, our big toes on our feet are not opposable. They are in the direct line of our bodies. And so these footprints, which are 3.7 million years old, also show that these organisms had toes that were also in a direct line with the rest of their body. So this is indicative of the fact that these organisms did not live in the trees. They probably walked on 2 legs. And therefore, that's evidence that they are an ancient ancestor of current modern humans. So we have to look through the rock layers. You have to be a geologist essentially or an anthropologist to study these fossils. And the cool thing about the rock layers is that they are quite literally time capsules. There's so much that we can learn from rock layers. We can study climate. We can understand what the weather was like at a certain period, many millions of years ago. We can understand what organisms were around many millions of years ago. We can know which plants grew in the area many millions of years ago simply by looking at the rocks. And if you ever are fortunate enough to travel to the mountains, whether they be the Rocky Mountains in the west part of our country or the Smoky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern part of our country, you will be able to see in some portions different layers in the rocks like this that have come about because throughout many hundreds of thousands and millions of years, different events led to the rocks having different characteristics. And depending on where we find the fossils, we have a good idea of how old the fossil might be. So of these 4 layers, A, B, C, or D, or you can even do 1, 2, 3, or 4, which of these layers is the oldest and which one would be the youngest? Which of those layers would be the oldest and which one would be the youngest?
D is the youngest, right? I mean, the oldest, right?
Yes, D is indeed the oldest. Excellent. And A is the youngest. The reason for this is that, again, when we think about the movement of tectonic plates that exist just below the surface, as those plates move, some of them get submerged. They get another tectonic plate will slide on top of them. Often that will lead to earthquakes, but that is a quite natural occurrence that takes place on our planet. Because again, there is the core of our Earth is extremely hot. And so the inner mantle is basically lava. And that causes the tectonic plates on top of the lava to shift every once in a while. And as those shifts take place, some of the tectonic plates get thrust under, and it leads to the younger tectonic plates being on top and the older tectonic plates being on the bottom. The second type of evidence that we discuss is comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is defined as organs and skeletal structures that appear in the bodies of various species across multiple phyla and classes, suggesting a common ancestor. So again, please do write that definition down. Okay. So we can look at this species, Tiktaalik roseae, which lived about 375 million years ago and represents a transition between fish and early tetrapods. We can look at it and see some similar characteristics between both fish and tetrapods, which are organisms that have 4 limbs, like human beings, like most of the mammals and vertebrates that we know. So some of those similar structures are wrist joints, wrist joints that would have allowed Tiktaalik roseae to emerge out of the water temporarily. rib bones, and lungs that again would have allowed Tiktaalik rosei to breathe outside of the water. As we know, fish have gills. They can't breathe outside of the water. Tiktaalik rosei also had an ear region. Now I say an ear region because it's not exactly the ear that you and I know. It's not the ear that allows us to hear, and it's definitely not. It didn't have the hearing abilities that we would associate with a human, but it did have an ear region that allowed it to process sound. And as that region evolved, it became more and more complex. It also has a mobile neck, or had a mobile neck. This is an extinct organism, which allowed it to move its head without moving the rest of its body. So just think about the fact that you and I can look from left to right. We can look up and down without having to move our whole bodies. But if you think about fish, they don't have those neck bones and neck muscles that allow them to do that. They have to shift their entire bodies. So this organism, Tiktaalik rosei, represents a pretty strong link between life when it only existed in the water and life as it exists today in the form of mammals. So there's reason to believe that this is a common ancestor of many of the forms of life on planet Earth today. Now, I want to do a quick scientific name review. We talked about scientific names on Monday. When we classified, we talked about the 8 levels of classification: domain, kingdom, phylum, order, family. I skipped one. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Those are our 8 levels of organization. But when we're naming an organism, we obviously don't want to have to use all 8 levels. That would just be pretty tedious and it would take a long time. So we shorten it into a scientific name and we only include 2 of those levels. Which level is that? Which level is Tiktaalik? Of those 8 levels, which level is that first name? Which level of classification is this name right here? We have 8 of them. I'll give you a hint. It's the second most specific. It's the second most specific level.
Rib. As similar structure between sonorosi and mammals. The rib bones, lungs, air region, mobile neck. I don't even know, to be honest with you. 8 of them.
Okay, again, we type it into the chat. We've got 8 levels of classification. Now, I know you all have taken notes on this. We talked about it on Monday. We've got domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Those are our 8 levels of classification. When we are naming an organism or naming a species, it would be very tedious to have to write out all of these 8 levels. So we shorten it to just 2. That's what we call the scientific name. So I'm asking, which of those 8 levels is this first name right here, Tiktaalik? Which of those 8 levels is this? All right. Nope, it's not the phylum. It is the genus. It's the genus. So again, the domain is the most general level. It's the most zoomed out level. Species is the most specific level. So this second letter, I'm sorry, the second word, roseae, that is the species. The genus is Tiktaalik, the species is roseae. So your scientific name is made up of the genus and the species. Now, I'm glad this happened because clearly the number of people who don't know indicates that you all did not do the flip and flop assignment from day one. That assignment walks you through this exact procedure, how you scientifically name something. I have to reiterate, guys, that this live portion of class is only one part of the class. It's only half of the instruction. The other half of the instruction comes from doing the asynchronous assignments. So you all really, really, really have to do those assignments, not just because they give you points for Power School, but because they teach you the information that you need to know to be successful in the class. All right, so we'll talk more about that at the end of the lesson, but I have to emphasize those asynchronous assignments. Now, when we think about comparative anatomy, we also have to acknowledge that there are what are called homologous structures. We see that prefix homo again. Homo means same. So homologous structures are similar anatomic features between different species. And this suggests a common ancestor. So please, again, you should be writing everything down that's highlighted. We got to take notes, folks. We have to take notes. So we can see in these four different species, human, dog, dolphin, and fruit bat, some homologous structures in one of the limbs. In the human arm, we've got a humerus bone. Some of you may have hit your elbow in the past and you've heard someone say, oh, you hit your funny bone. Your funny bone is basically the end of it's the distal end of your humerus. This portion of the bone right here, it has a lot of nerve endings. And so when you hit your elbow, you're hitting this bone right here, and it can hurt because you've got a lot of nerve endings right there. We call it the funny bone because it's the humerus. Okay, so that's just good to know. In your lower arm, in the more distal part of your arm, you've got two other bones. The one that's on your thumb side is called the radius, and the one that's on your pinky side is called your ulna. The cool thing is that we can look at these other species and see that they have the exact same general structure. These bones likely have different names, but we can follow their structure and see that they're quite similar. In the human wrist, we've got carpals. We've got about 8 bones in our wrist. So when you hear someone say they fractured their wrist, usually it's the case that only one of those 8 bones is fractured, unless it's a much more severe break or it's a compound fracture. Then the palm of our hand has what are called metacarpals, and then our fingers are called phalanges. And we can see that same general structure taking place in other species. That suggests that we have a common ancestor. And eventually we evolved from that common ancestor and we split apart into different species, but we maintained very similar structures. Even look at the bones of the whale and the whale's fins. You can see that the phalanges are organized in very similar ways. They've got 5 of them. Dogs typically have 5 as well. You can't see the 5th one right now because it's usually behind their carpals. We can see the fruit bat has 5 also. So it's interesting stuff. And then we also, when we're talking about comparative anatomy, have to think about vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are anatomic features that may have had an ancestral function, but they have lost all function in the living species. This means that if you go back far enough and you find an ancestor of human beings, that ancestor would have had some need to move its ears to locate the source of a sound. If you have a dog at home, maybe you've seen your dog do that. Somebody makes a loud noise, suddenly you hear a clap, and the dog's ears will perk up and they'll move towards the source of the sound. We have the ability, we have muscles, we've got 3 muscles that surround our ears that allow us to move our ears. Some of us can do it better than others. And if you try to move your eyebrows up and down, you should feel your ears moving as well. But of course, we have no real need for large ears that can scan around to locate the source of sounds. That is probably a remnant of some nocturnal ancestor of ours that needed to be much more careful about approaching predators. Maybe you've also heard of somebody having appendicitis. Appendicitis is when the appendix gets inflamed and it might even get so swollen that it bursts, and that can be extremely painful. And so those people will end up having appendectomies, which means that they will have the appendix surgically removed. It's a pretty common procedure. The appendix is one of these vestigial structures as well, because it actually does nothing for our bodies. And so that's why we can take it out without there being any negative consequences. Same thing with wisdom teeth. Once you hit a certain age, more likely than not, your dentist will start talking about having your wisdom teeth removed, because they can cause problems, but we don't need them. Some of our ancestors may have needed them to grind food down more, but we have molars that can do that perfectly fine. All right, so vestigial structures, at some point in the past, our ancestors needed them, but the current living species do not. The third type of evidence that we talk about is comparative biochemistry. So we talked about comparative anatomy. We also have to mention comparative biochemistry. This is an analysis of DNA or proteins for similarities between 2 different species in order to determine their common ancestry. So we can look at the genes of different species and see how similar the DNA in those genes are to determine how likely it is that they share a common ancestor, or how closely related those species are. Okay. So quick throwback to Unit 6 when we introduced these DNA fingerprints. In this case, we've got bands of DNA, which are represented by these black rectangles. We know that the more bands 2 individuals, or in this case 2 species, have in common, the more closely related they are. So we can literally count and see how many bands they have in common and determine which 2 are more likely, or which one is most likely to be related to species 1. So let's just do a count. We can see that in this first band, all three of the species share that band in common with species one. So they all have at least one similarity to species one. Same thing with the second band. They all have that one in common as well. So now they all have two similarities. So we just keep going and we keep counting. And when we get all the way to the end, when we get to the bottom, we should know which of these three species is most closely related to the species one. Maybe you can look at it and already tell, but it's always good to check your work in this way. So we're just keeping count and going band by band, and I'm just keeping count. So the end results is that species 3 shares 8 bands in common with species 1. 8 of the 9. So that means that species 3 is most closely related to species 1. Excuse me. And then the fourth type of evidence that we seek is called comparative embryology. Thank you, Jessica. You were correct. Comparative embryology is defined as an analysis of embryo development that indicates common ancestry. So we look at the embryos of different species when they are in their earliest stages of development. And we see plenty of similarities. So if we look at these 5, I will tell you, these are 5 different species. If we look at these 5 different species, can you identify any of them? Anybody have any guesses as to what these things are?
Sperm or something like that?
No, these are embryos, but I'm asking does anybody know which species these are? Sperm don't have eyes. Okay, no guesses. No guesses about what species these are, which is perfectly reasonable because they all look basically the same. Now let's go to the next level, the next stage of development. Anybody have any guesses now? Now that they've developed a little bit further. Okay, no guesses. All right, well, let's see the results. So once these embryos have matured, they still haven't been born yet, but they are more mature embryos. We can see that there are now dramatic differences between them. This is a fish embryo or a fish fetus. This is a salamander fetus. This is a tortoise. This is a chicken, and this is a human being. So if we compare this all the way back to their earliest stages of development, we can see they look almost nothing like what they once looked like, and they all look basically the same. This indicates common ancestry. This is indicative of the fact that we all, at some point, mammals and even some amphibians and even some fish came from some common ancestor. Another throwback question. We got to think all the way back to Unit 5 for this one. What happens in the early stages of embryonic development to create different tissues and organs? How do different, what's the process that ends up creating different tissues and different organs? They all have different jobs. What's that process called? So Unit 5 question. What happens in the earliest stages of development that allows cells to end up with different jobs? All right. That process is called cell specialization. So the cells get specialized, they get differentiated, they end up having different jobs. They start off as one type of cell, a stem cell, but they become any number of cells. They can be the cells in your muscles, the cells in your eyes. They can be the cells in your lungs. Question?
It look like a toad.
Thank you, Anthony. Yes. All right. Practice question. Which of the following provides the most compelling evidence for the theory of evolution? Which one provides the most compelling, meaning the strongest evidence for the theory of evolution?
A,
Why do you say that?
because it has proof for it.
B.
Why do you say that, Jaden?
I don't know.
I seen it in the chat, so I went what they said.
Saying A, a lot of A. Okay, well, it's actually B.
Oh,
Yes.
yes, no.
Fossil records rely on dating technology. We don't really know. We can place it in a range. We can say something is between 300 and 400,000 years old. But it's not the best. With the biochemistry, if we can find a source of DNA, we can say, almost with a higher degree of certainty that two organisms are related to one another. We can say these organisms share 92% of their DNA. These organisms share 96% of their DNA. That means that they are very, very similar. Keep in mind, a human being and a fruit fly share about 90% of their DNA. Okay, and obviously we are two very different species. So if we can look at a DNA fingerprint of a different organism or different species, and it comes back that it's 97% similar, that's a pretty big deal. All right, let's watch this video and then we'll be done.
Your body is a temple, but it's also a museum of natural history. Look closely and you'll see parts that aren't there because you need them, but because your animal ancestors did. No longer serving their previous function, but not costly enough to have disappeared. These remnants of our deep history only make sense within the framework of evolution by natural selection. With your arm on a flat surface, push your thumb against your pinky and tip your hand slightly up. If you see a raised band in the middle of your wrist, you've got a vestigial muscle in your forearm. That tendon you see connects to the palmaris longus, a muscle that around 10 to 15% of people are missing on one or both of their arms. It doesn't make them any weaker though. There's no difference in grip strength. In fact, it's one of the first tendons that surgeons will take out so that they can use it in reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. You can find the palmaris longus across mammal species, but it's most developed among those that use their forelimbs to move around. In primates, that means the muscle is longer in lemurs and monkeys and shorter in chimps, gorillas, and other apes that don't do a lot of scrambling through trees. It's not the only leftover muscle that we've got. Look at the three that are attached to our outer ear. We can't get much movement out of these muscles, especially compared to some of our mammal relatives who use them to locate the sources of sounds. Presumably, this would have been quite helpful for early nocturnal mammals. In humans, you can still detect the remnants of this adaptation with electrodes. In one study, researchers recorded a spike of activity in the ear muscle cells in response to a sudden sound. Not enough to move the ear, but detectable. And you can probably guess the location of the sound based on these results. It came from a speaker placed to the left of the study subjects. So this is their left ear subconsciously trying and failing to pivot toward the sound. You can see another futile effort by our vestigial body parts when you get goosebumps. When we're cold, tiny muscles attached to our body hairs contract, pulling the hair upright, which causes the surrounding skin to form a bump. For our furry mammal relatives, the raised hair increases the amount of space for insulation, helping them stay warm. Birds can do this too. You've probably seen a puffy pigeon on a cold day. Adrenaline is one of the hormones involved in the body's response to cold temperatures, and it's also part of the fight or flight response. So it helps some animals appear larger when they're threatened. And it may be why surprising and emotional turns in music can give some people goosebumps. And then there's our tail. At the end of our spine are a set of fused vertebrae. Some people have 3, some people have 5. We call it the tailbone. It now serves as an anchor for some pelvic muscles, but it's also what's left of our ancestors' tails. Every one of us actually had a tail at one point. When the basic body plan is being laid out at around 4 weeks of gestation, human embryos closely resemble embryos of other vertebrates, and that includes a tail with 10 to 12 developing vertebrae. In many other animals, it continues to develop into a proper tail, but in humans and other apes, the cells in the tail are programmed to die a few weeks after they appear. Very rarely, though, a mutation allows the ancestral blueprint to prevail, and a human baby will be born with a true vestigial tail. The most adorable vestigial behavior is the palmar grasp reflex, where infants up until they're about 6 months old have this incredible grasp on whatever you put in their hand. There's a similar reflex for their feet. I wanted to show you this great piece of footage from the 1930s where they demonstrated this behavior. These babies are only 1 month old, and you can see that their inner monkey can support their entire weight.
All right, so we got 2 more minutes. So what I do want to share with you all, of course, there is an exit ticket as there is every day. And of course, there is an asynchronous assignment. We're 4 days into the unit and there are several assignments that are available for you all to do. I will be updating grades as we go. So I know some of you have turned in work from Unit 6 and Unit 7. That will be reflected in the grade book this weekend. I do still need to hear from quite a few of you about taking the Unit 7 exam. So please reach out to me if I mentioned your name at the beginning of the class period. I also want to mention that the Kahoot, there is a Kahoot available. And some of you have attempted. I appreciate that. I've gotten attempts from Alyssa, Nick, and McKyron, and DeMarco. Yeah, I think that's it. So the rest of you, definitely, you can take this on your own time. Obviously, all of our assignments are due on Wednesday, the 18th at 11:59 p.m. But why wait until then? This should be something that's pretty easy to go ahead and knock out. It's only 20 questions and easy 20 points. If you're not happy with your score, you're more than welcome to take it again.
Wait, which one's for 20 points again?
The Kahoot that I just sent to the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so please, Brian, question?
Oh, I was gonna say the Unit 7 quiz. What do we do about what's it again?
The Unit 7 test.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to schedule a time to take it. We can't take it during class, but we can do it before school, after school, during the advisory period on Tuesday or Thursday. Up to you. Just send me an email or a text message.
Okay.
Why is not letting us take the Kahoot?
What is it telling you?
Oh, never mind.
All right, well, it is 1:20, so I'm going to stop the recording, and you all are good to go. Please, folks, please do make some progress this week.